Lavender Envelope, a story of betrayal, loss, danger, and new beginning. Imagine building a $12 million empire over 30 years, only to watch it crumble because of a receipt for roses, flowers you are deathly allergic to. Left broken on a kitchen floor by her cheating ex-husband, 58-year-old Ruby Alexander decided to reinvent her life halfway across the world in Lagos, Nigeria. Now she's taking the corporate world by storm and capturing the heart of Emmanuel Nwosu, a commanding, protective billionaire titan. But just as Ruby finds a love she never saw coming, a jealous, wealthy socialite plots a dangerous trap to eliminate her permanently. From public humiliation in Florida to high-stakes danger and romance in West Africa, you'll want to stick around for every second of this story. Let's get right into it. The glass of the Vanguard business and corporate law building in Lagos reflected a woman who looked a decade younger than her 58 years. Standing 5 feet 9 inches, her honey-brown skin radiant against the sharp lines of her tailored cream pantsuit, Ruby Alexander took a deep breath. She adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase, her short, expertly cropped hairstyle framing a face dominated by large, expressive eyes. Beneath the polished exterior, her nerves danced in the pit of her stomach. 11 months ago, she had been a broken woman on a kitchen floor in Orlando, Florida. Now she was half a world away. "Good morning, Ms. Alexander," a well-dressed, efficient young assistant said, breaking her thoughts with a polite bow of his head. "Please follow me." CEO Emmanuel Nwosu and the rest of the team are waiting in the blue conference room. The journey to Lagos had been paved with broken glass and public humiliation. For 30 years, Ruby and her ex-husband, Calvin Fields, a man with smooth caramel skin, a low-cut fade, the ability to charm his way through anything, and a neatly trimmed beard, had been the definition of a power couple. Together, they had built a $12 million corporate law powerhouse. But the foundation of Ruby's life crumbled the day she spotted a line item on their joint credit card. A dozen roses. She was deathly allergic to roses. For 3 agonizing weeks, she quietly investigated. The trail led her to a luxury hotel downtown. Peering through the restaurant glass, she watched Calvin sharing an intimate, laughing dinner with a 25-year-old exotic dancer named Madison Hill, stage name Cinnamon, whom he had met online. Ruby watched, frozen, as Calvin slipped a diamond ring onto the young woman's finger. Ruby didn't make a scene. She drove home in a trance, the tears starting in her driveway. They didn't stop when she stripped off her clothes, nor when the hot shower water hit her back. She cried herself to sleep, only to wake to Calvin walking in the next morning, smoothly lying about, falling asleep at the office on a big case. Ruby had just stared at him, watching the stranger who wore her husband's face, trying to process the death of her 30-year marriage. The divorce that followed was a media circus. Furious at being caught, Calvin used every ugly legal gimmick in the book. He tried to freeze her out of the firm's accounts, lock her out of their 6 properties, and even leaked altered emails to local news and social media to paint Ruby as unstable. But Calvin underestimated the lawyer he had trained alongside. Ruby took the fight to the public. She hired a fierce PR team, laying bare the truth. Social media branded Cinnamon a homewrecker, and Calvin was publicly dragged as a greedy, callous monster. In the end, the judge awarded Ruby half of their $12 million firm. Unable to face selling the business, Calvin was forced to liquidate his half of all their other properties, just to buy her out of his precious law firm. On a lonely Friday night in her rented Orlando townhome, the words, "Why not?" had settled into Ruby's mind. Why not Nigeria? Why not now, instead of in 10 years? She had stood up, doing what she always did when a choice threatened to rearrange her world. She did nothing, waiting to see if the decision would change into something else. 3 days later, the lavender-scented envelope arrived. Opening the elegant paper, her eyes caught the gold-embossed lettering. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Calvin Fields and Madison." The floor seemed to vanish. Ruby grabbed the kitchen island to brace herself, her throat tight, her body trembling. He was marrying her, and the heartless bastard had the nerve to send an invitation to the woman he tried to destroy. The envelope dropped. Ruby's body revolted, sending her into full, agonizing convulsions on the floor as a scream of pure, unadulterated rage and grief tore from her lungs. Her best friend Dawn had been at a nail salon when the gossip reached her. Hearing that Calvin had invited Ruby to the wedding, Dawn paid the tech for her half-finished nails and practically flew to Ruby's townhome. "Darling, come on, get up," Dawn had cooed, lifting Ruby from the floor. "I gave him 30 years. Ruby sobbed onto Dawn's shoulder on the sofa. 2 beautiful children, a foundation, an empire. I would rather die than attend that piece of crap's wedding. Dawn hadn't offered empty platitudes. She just held her, giving Ruby the space to breathe. 4 months later, that why not question refused to be ignored and forced Ruby to make a decision that changed her world. Ruby accepted an offer from Vanguard Business and Corporate Law in Lagos as a lead counsel for U.S. companies operating in Nigeria. On the first-class flight over the Atlantic, Ruby had finally exhaled, releasing 11 months of pain, disappointment, and lies that had held her hostage. The past few weeks in Nigeria had been a healing balm. The West African sun felt like soft kisses on her honey skin. She had immersed herself in decorating her new 2-bedroom apartment, overseeing the AC installation, and connecting with a vibrant community of U.S. expats. Orlando's viciousness was fading into a bad dream. Now she walked into the blue conference room. The room was framed by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling city of Lagos. At the head of the large mahogany table stood Mr. Emmanuel Nwosu. At 60 years old, he possessed a commanding presence that immediately anchored the room. As the CEO of Vanguard and 3 other multi-million-dollar ventures spanning telecommunications, real estate and shipping, Emmanuel was a titan of industry. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a sharp dark suit tailored perfectly over a lean, disciplined physique, a body that clearly reflected the rigor of his 5 a.m. runs and intense judo sessions. As he turned to face her, a subtle, intoxicating scent preceded him, a sophisticated blend of rich tobacco and the crisp, salty tang of the nearby sea. His complexion was a deep, rich dark chocolate, and his piercing eyes crinkled warmly at the corners as a genuine smile broke across his face. Emmanuel normally never attended standard corporate meet and greets. His relentless schedule simply didn't allow for it, and he routinely delegated onboarding to his executive team. But when Ruby's file had crossed his desk, something about her photograph had completely arrested his attention. It wasn't just her striking youthful beauty, or her large expressive eyes. It was the quiet, defiant fire burning beneath them. He had recognized a fellow warrior, and he knew he had to meet her in person. "Ah, Ms. Alexander," Emmanuel said, his voice a rich, deep baritone that seemed to instantly ground the remaining flutter of nerves in her stomach. He stepped forward, extending a hand. "We have been eagerly anticipating your arrival. Your reputation precedes you, and frankly, what you did to protect your assets in your previous partnership was a masterclass in litigation." Ruby blinked, a slow smile spreading across her lips as she shook his hand. His grip was firm, a testament to his martial arts training, yet remarkably gentle. He wasn't looking at her as a victim of a public scandal. He was looking at her as a formidable legal mind. "Thank you, Mr. Nwosu," Ruby said, her voice steady and confident. "I look forward to bringing that same tenacity to Vanguard." Emmanuel's dark eyes lingered on hers for a second longer than strictly professional, taking in the brilliance of her large eyes and the grace of her stature. Even after the briefing concluded and the conference room cleared, Ruby found that she could not shake Emmanuel from her thoughts. Throughout the entire afternoon, as she reviewed international compliance laws and set up her new office, his image kept flashing in her mind. She found herself recalling the precise shade of his rich, dark complexion, and the way his tailored suit hinted at the powerful, athletic frame beneath it. Every time she closed her eyes, the faint, sophisticated scent of rich tobacco and the sea seemed to linger in the room. More than his looks, it was the way he had spoken to her. For months Calvin's mind games had made her feel small, but Emmanuel's piercing gaze had made her feel entirely seen and respected. That evening, as Ruby sat on her balcony watching the sun set over the vibrant, sprawling Lagos skyline, she realized she was smiling. For the past 11 months her mind had been a prison of painful memories and legal battles. But tonight, for the very first time, her thoughts were entirely occupied by a future, and a man she never saw coming. 2 weeks later, Ruby found herself at a high-profile corporate gala, hosted at a luxury hotel overlooking the Atlantic. The ballroom was a sea of Lagos elite, politicians and international investors. Ruby looked stunning, her 5 feet 9 inches curvy frame poured into a sophisticated, body-skimming purple gown that complemented her honey-brown skin and large, luminous eyes. As she sipped her champagne and chatted with a group of expats, she felt a familiar, magnetic shift in the room's energy. She turned her head and caught sight of Emmanuel. He was breathtaking, dressed in a custom black tuxedo that accentuated his lean, athletic build. But he wasn't alone. Clinging tightly to his arm was a glamorous, heavily jeweled woman named Chloe, the daughter of a wealthy oil magnate. Chloe was known in elite circles for being incredibly possessive, treating Emmanuel less like a partner and more like a prized trophy she had already claimed. Despite the woman on his arm, Emmanuel's piercing eyes scanned the crowd until they locked directly onto Ruby. The moment he saw her, the rest of the room seemed to fade for him. Even as Chloe prattled on, gesturing grandly to acquaintances, Emmanuel's gaze kept drifting back to Ruby, his eyes tracking her every movement with intense curiosity. It didn't take long for Chloe to notice. She followed Emmanuel's line of sight, her eyes landing on the gorgeous American lawyer who looked entirely too vibrant and too comfortable in this room. Jealousy flashed hot and dark across Chloe's face. Tightening her grip on Emmanuel's arm, she narrowed her eyes, instantly deciding that Ruby Alexander was a dangerous threat, and one that must be dealt with. Emmanuel, entirely unfazed by Chloe's tightening grip, waited for the perfect moment when Chloe was distracted by a group of her wealthy socialite friends. Slipping away with practiced ease, he navigated the crowded ballroom, his towering frame cutting a path straight toward Ruby. "Good evening, Ms. Alexander." His rich, deep baritone voice brushed against her ear, sending a delicious shiver down her spine. He stepped into her space, bringing with him that intoxicating scent of tobacco and the sea. Or should I say, the most captivating woman in the room. Ruby turned, her heart doing a familiar flutter as she looked up into his crinkling dark eyes. "Mr. Nwosu, I see you managed to escape your shadow." Emmanuel let out a low, rumbling laugh, his eyes dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her gaze with a dangerous, playful spark. "For the right woman, I am capable of a great many escapes. Tell me, Ruby, are you enjoying Lagos, or do I need to personally show you what this city really has to offer?" The heat of the ballroom grew oppressive, and Emmanuel subtly guided Ruby toward the arched glass doors leading to a secluded terrace. The night air rolling off the Atlantic was cool, carrying the sharp, crisp scent of the sea that perfectly matched Emmanuel's cologne. "I needed a moment of stillness," Emmanuel murmured, leaning against the stone railing, his dark eyes fixed entirely on Ruby. "Or perhaps, I simply wanted you all to myself." Ruby felt a sudden heat rise to her cheeks, a genuine blush she hadn't experienced in decades. "You are a dangerous man, Emmanuel. Do you always get what you want?" "When it matters, yes," he said softly, stepping closer. The distance between them vanished. His towering, athletic frame shielded her from the wind, and his hand rose to gently brush a stray lock of her cropped hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her honey skin, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "You look utterly breathtaking tonight, Ruby. I haven't been able to think of anything else since you walked into my boardroom." His eyes dropped to her lips, and he began to lean in, his intent unmistakable. Ruby's heart hammered against her ribs, her breath catching in anticipation of his mouth meeting hers. "Emmanuel!" The sharp, brittle voice cut through the darkness. Chloe stood in the doorway, her face contorted with fury. She didn't create a loud scene, mindful of her father's status in the ballroom just yards away, but she marched toward them, her eyes flashing like daggers. "I see you've found the new American hire," Chloe sneered, crossing her arms and looking Ruby up and down with practiced disdain. "Emmanuel, really? I know Vanguard prides itself on charity, but I didn't realize your corporate hospitality extended to entertaining middle-aged divorcees, desperate for a second act in Africa." The insult was designed to sting, to reduce Ruby to a cliché, but Ruby Alexander had just survived a year-long legal war with a narcissist. A spoiled socialite was nothing. Ruby smiled smoothly, stepping forward with the effortless poise of a woman who owned every inch of her 5 feet 9 inches frame. "And you are?" Ruby asked. "Chloe, Emmanuel's fiancée," Chloe retorted with pure disdain. "Does he know he's your fiancée?" Ruby inquired, her voice calm, measured, and laced with professional pity. "Because I've had many conversations with Emmanuel, and he's never once mentioned you in any capacity, let alone as his fiancée," Ruby continued, her tone maintaining that same calm professional pity. Seeing that her words had landed, Ruby added, "Since your fiancé isn't acknowledging you publicly, you seem to have bigger problems than him entertaining middle-aged divorcees desperate for a second act in Africa," she said, using air quotes around the word fiancé for emphasis. Chloe's jaw dropped, her face flushing crimson as she struggled to find words. The tables had been entirely turned, leaving the heiress utterly embarrassed in the quiet of the terrace. Before Chloe could screech a response, Emmanuel stepped between them, his expression ice-cold. "That is enough, Chloe, let's go." Seeing the finality in his piercing dark eyes, Chloe let out a sharp gasp, turned on her designer heels, and stormed off. Emmanuel turned back to Ruby, a look of profound admiration burning in his eyes. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "We will finish what we started tonight, later," he whispered, his voice a promise that left her shivering. The encounter left Ruby completely shaken, but in the best way possible. For months, she had felt like a victim of Calvin's betrayal. But defending herself against Chloe, while feeling the fierce protection of a man like Emmanuel, made her feel powerful, desired, and alive again. The next morning, Emmanuel called her private line. His rich baritone voice left no room for negotiation. He asked her out for lunch. Ruby's initial instinct was to say no. He was her CEO, and she was still healing from the wreckage of her marriage. But as she opened her mouth to decline, the memory of his scent, his touch on the balcony, and the sheer magnetism of his presence overwhelmed her. She couldn't resist him. She said yes. The lunch date morphed into an extraordinary, day-long adventure. They began at an exclusive private estate outside the city. Emmanuel, a natural athlete, took her horseback riding along a pristine, secluded beach. Ruby's curves moved with the rhythm of the horse, the sea breeze in her face making her laugh louder than she had in a year. Afterward, as the sun began to dip, he surprised her with a private hot air balloon ride. As they floated high above the breathtaking Nigerian landscape, bathed in the golden crimson hues of the African sunset, the intimacy between them deepened. Ensconced in the quiet of the basket, Ruby found herself opening up. She told him everything. The painful details of her 30-year marriage to Calvin, the sting of the credit card charge for the roses she was allergic to, the humiliation of the public divorce, and the final, cruel insult of the lavender wedding invitation. She explained how those two words, "why not?" had saved her and brought her to Lagos. Emmanuel listened with an intensity that made her feel cherished. He didn't offer empty pity. Instead, his dark eyes burned with a protective, fierce respect. When the balloon safely touched down in a secluded field, the tension between them reached a boiling point. Emmanuel reached for her, pulling her 5 feet 9 inches frame flush against his hard, disciplined body. His mouth found hers, and the kiss was nothing short of a revelation. It began with an explosive, long-simmering passion, his demanding and deep lips tasting of the rich tobacco and sea breeze that defined him. Ruby tangled her fingers into the short hair at the back of his neck, leaning into his strength, surrendering to the intoxicating heat of his tongue. The kiss deepened, a desperate, beautiful collision of two powerful souls recognizing each other. Then, gently, Emmanuel pulled back, his breathing ragged, his forehead resting against hers. He stroked her cheek, his thumb tracing her lower lip. "If I don't stop now, Ruby, I won't stop at all," he murmured, his voice thick with desire. "And I refuse to rush you. You deserve to be courted properly." The restraint only fueled their fire. In the weeks that followed, they went on several more dates, becoming practically inseparable. They reflected often on that shared passion, realizing it wasn't just physical attraction, it was a profound emotional alignment. Emmanuel gave her back the confidence Calvin had tried to steal, and Ruby brought a vibrant, fierce light into Emmanuel's structured, corporate world. Ruby realized that her growing feelings for Emmanuel could no longer be ignored. She decided that she needed to understand whether what was happening between them was genuine and mutual, and not just one-sided, or simply occupying his time. She also felt it was important to find out more about Chloe, to understand her role in Emmanuel's life, and what it meant for their future. Determined to gain clarity, Ruby knew she had to have an honest conversation with Emmanuel, and perhaps learn the truth about Chloe and his feelings. The terrace doors of Emmanuel's penthouse were open, letting in the steady, rhythmic sound of the Atlantic surf. Ruby sat on the plush sofa, a warm mug of tea between her hands, her large eyes fixed on the city lights. Emmanuel walked over, his tall frame moving with the quiet grace of his morning runs, and sat down beside her. He didn't push for words, simply placing a heavy, reassuring hand on her shoulder. The comforting scent of tobacco and the sea enveloped her, grounding her racing thoughts. Ruby took a deep breath, turning her head to look directly into his piercing dark eyes. The vulnerability she had been carrying for weeks could no longer be contained. "Emmanuel, my feelings for you, they aren't going away," Ruby admitted, her voice soft but steady. "In fact, they are only getting stronger. But I need to ask you about Chloe. Truly." Emmanuel's expression softened, his deep, rich complexion catching the amber light of the room. He remained quiet, letting her speak. Ruby set her mug down, her honey-brown skin tightening as old, painful memories flashed behind her eyes. I need to understand what she is to you. After everything I went through with Calvin, the lies, the public humiliation, the sheer agony of being betrayed, I refuse to be the cause of that for someone else. I will not inflict the same kind of pain that nearly destroyed me onto another woman, no matter who she is." Emmanuel looked at her, a profound respect mirroring in his eyes. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his firm, calloused grip. "Ruby, look at me," Emmanuel said, his rich baritone voice washing over her. "There is absolutely no love between Chloe and me. To her, I am nothing more than a status symbol, a powerful, wealthy businessman to parade around Lagos high society to please her father and elevate her own standing." He leaned back slightly, a cold, knowing smile touching his lips. "Chloe believes she is clever, but she has no idea that I know the truth. I know all about her year-long affair with one of the top managers at her father's oil firm. I even know about the reckless fling she had with that politician last year." Ruby blinked in surprise, her legal mind instantly processing the information. "You never said anything to her about this?" "No," Emmanuel replied simply. "Then why?" Ruby asked, her brow furrowing as she searched his face. "Why were you still with her after knowing all of that? A man of your stature, your principal. Why stay?" Emmanuel paused, staring out at the ocean for a long moment. The question forced him to look into a mirror he had avoided for a long time. Finally he turned back to Ruby, his eyes filled with a raw honesty. "Because she was familiar," Emmanuel confessed, his voice dropping to a quiet rumble, "and she was uncomplicated. My life is consumed by running Vanguard and 3 other massive ventures. I pour all of my passion, my energy and my intensity into my work and my discipline. With Chloe, I didn't have to invest my heart. It was a transactional, predictable arrangement that required nothing real from me. It was easy to let it drift because I didn't care enough to stop it." He squeezed Ruby's hand, sliding into her space until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "But then your file crossed my desk. Then I saw your face, and then I met you. You are not a transaction, Ruby. You are entirely complicated in the most beautiful way, because you make me feel things I haven't felt in a very long time. There is no standard to maintain with Chloe anymore, because with you, I finally want something real." "I love you, Ruby Alexander," he said, allowing all the feelings his words carried to show. "I'm not asking for you to say anything. I just wanted you to know that I love you," he finished, looking like a man who had just released a heavy weight he had been carrying. Ruby looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She kissed him, as her words seemed ill-equipped to express how much she loved him. Pulling back just enough to look into his eyes, she said, "Emmanuel, you are the thing I didn't know I needed. You came into my life and showed me that love is still possible. I love you with all of me." Hearing her declare her love caused his body to tighten. His eyes grew dark with passion, and he kissed her fiercely, holding her as if he was afraid she might disappear. She leaned into him, allowing herself to feel the full gravity of their passion, surrendering to the depths of their love. As their relationship deepened, the reality of their professional dynamic loomed. Emmanuel was the CEO of Vanguard, and Ruby was his employee. To avoid any conflict of interest or HR complications, Emmanuel used his massive network to refer Ruby to another global corporation, where she was immediately hired as the lead counsel for their international legal team. The transition was seamless, cementing her as an independent powerhouse in Lagos. However, the ghost of the past wasn't finished. A week later, Ruby arrived at Emmanuel's private penthouse to surprise him, only to walk into a tense, volatile scene. Chloe was there, to confront Emmanuel about him being distant, cancelling their social engagements, and completely avoiding her calls to spend every waking hour with Ruby. Chloe had cornered him. "You are throwing away everything we have for an American nomad," Chloe shrieked, as Ruby walked through the door. Ruby didn't flinch at the insult. She simply smiled, and told Emmanuel that she would be in the study when he was finished. She cast a dismissive glance at Chloe, then turned and walked away. Emmanuel looked at Chloe with absolute finality. "I told you weeks ago, Chloe, we are done. Leave Ruby's name out of your mouth, and leave my home." Humiliated and consumed by an ugly, blinding rage, Chloe stormed out. But in her mind, a dark plot took root. She decided that if Emmanuel wouldn't have her, he wouldn't have Ruby either. Ruby was a threat that needed to be eliminated permanently. The quiet in the massive Orlando house was deafening. Calvin Field sat alone at the edge of his plush leather armchair, the glowing screen of his phone illuminating the dark room. It was 3:15 a.m. He looked down at the empty glass of bourbon in his hand, then back at the phone. No texts, no missed calls. He had absolutely no idea where his wife was. Again, Madison, the woman he had thrown away a 30-year legacy for, was out partying. When they first met online, her youth and carefree lifestyle had felt like an intoxicating escape. Now, it was a financial and emotional prison. Madison didn't cook. She didn't clean. She refused to work, claiming her brand required her full-time attention. All she did was spend his money, draining his accounts on designer clothes, VIP tables, and trips with her friends, leaving him alone in an echoing house that used to feel like a home. In the suffocating silence, Calvin's mind did something it had been doing with agonizing frequency lately. It drifted back to Ruby. He closed his eyes, remembering all the little things Ruby used to do without a single complaint. He remembered how she always knew exactly how he liked his coffee in the morning, how she subtly handled his difficult clients before they could ever stress him out, and how her laughter used to fill the hallways. Ruby had built a sanctuary for them. Madison had turned it into a revolving door for her late-night entourage. A heavy wave of hopelessness washed over him. Sitting there in the dark, Calvin finally admitted the terrifying truth to himself. He had made a catastrophic mistake. The consequences weren't just personal, they were professional. Since the very public, brutal divorce, the law firm had taken a massive hit. Clients had jumped ship, disgusted by the media fallout, and the firm was no longer thriving. Without Ruby, the remaining operations were clunky and disorganized. Calvin had always carried himself with the arrogance of a man who thought he was the center of his own universe. But looking at his dwindling balance sheets, the reality was stark. Ruby was the real brains behind their success. Her brilliant legal mind and strategic brilliance had been the engine of their $12 million empire. Without her, he was just a man drowning in his own poor choices. He had thought about reaching out to Ruby many times, but he could never summon the resolve to do it. Then, out of the blue, Maya, his oldest, called him after he casually asked his son Trey about their mother. He replayed that call from Maya over and over again. It was etched into his mind, seared deep within his memory. It was another lonely night his phone buzzed, cutting through his thoughts. He answered it instantly, hoping it was Madison calling for a ride. "Dad?" It was his daughter's voice. It was flat, cold, and distant. Since the whole Madison situation blew up, his children had practically disowned him. His daughter hadn't spoken more than 10 words to him in months. Whenever he tried to reach out, he was met with a wall of icy silence. "Maya," Calvin said, his voice cracking slightly with a sudden surge of pathetic hope. "It's so good to hear your voice. Are you—" "I'm only calling because I wanted you to hear it from me first," Maya interrupted, cutting him off before he could try to play the doting father. "Mum is living in Lagos now." Calvin blinked, his chest tightening. "Lagos? Nigeria? What is she doing all the way out there?" "She's thriving," Maya said, a distinct note of pride and a hint of satisfaction bleeding into her tone. "She's the lead counsel for a major international legal team. Oh, and she's dating a billionaire, an actual, powerful, brilliant billionaire who treats her like a queen." Calvin choked on his breath, the air completely leaving his lungs. "Oh, a billionaire? Yeah. A real man," Maya said coldly. "Anyway, that's all. Don't call me back." The line went dead. Calvin lowered the phone, his hand trembling as the dial tone hummed in his ear. His daughter had broken her silence just to deliver a killing blow. His wife, no, his ex-wife, had completely outgrown the wreckage he had caused. She was half a world away, brilliant, successful and loved by a titan, while he was sitting in the dark, waiting for an exotic dancer to come home and spend the rest of his crumbling fortune. The call from Maya was clear. It was her warning to him to leave their mother alone. He stared out the window into the empty driveway, completely, utterly hopeless. 2 nights later, as Ruby walked to her car after a late session at her new corporate office, she was blindsided. 2 men stepped out of the shadows. A cloth laced with chloroform was pressed to her face, and the world went black. When Ruby woke up, her hands were bound, and she was tied to a chair in a dark, humid warehouse near the Lagos docks. The door creaked open, and Chloe stepped inside, flanked by hired thugs. Chloe's wealthy facade was gone, replaced by the manic look of a woman scorned. "You think you can come to my country and take what is mine?" Chloe hissed, slapping Ruby across the face. Ruby's large eyes flared with anger, refusing to show fear. Chloe pulled out a phone, displaying photos of Ruby's 2 adult children back in the United States, taken by private investigators. "You are going to sign a resignation letter, get on a flight back to Orlando tonight and never return." If you don't, your children's lives are in danger. Accidents happen very easily in the States, counselor. Panic seized Ruby's heart, not for herself but for her children. Meanwhile, Emmanuel's 5 a.m. run had been cut short by an instinctual, gut-wrenching dread when Ruby didn't answer his calls. Knowing Chloe's volatile nature, he immediately used his vast shipping and real estate connections to track Chloe's recent movements and phone records. Within hours, his security team traced her to an abandoned warehouse owned by one of Chloe's father's shell companies. Emmanuel didn't wait for the authorities. Fueled by a raw, protective rage, he arrived at the warehouse like a force of nature. The heavy doors were shattered open. Before the hired thugs could even draw their weapons, Emmanuel's decades of intense judo training took over. He moved with lethal, fluid precision, throwing the first man over his shoulder onto the concrete floor with bone-shattering force, and disarming the second with a swift, brutal strike to the throat. Chloe screamed, backing away in terror as Emmanuel turned his piercing dark eyes toward her. The commanding presence he usually held in boardrooms was now a terrifying aura of absolute authority. "Touch her again, Chloe, and your father's empire will be reduced to ash by noon," Emmanuel growled, his voice vibrating with danger. He rushed to Ruby's side, his powerful hands quickly cutting her bonds. The moment she was free, Ruby threw her arms around his neck, burying her face into his chest, inhaling the scent of tobacco and the sea that now meant safety, home, and unconditional love. "I've got you," Emmanuel whispered fiercely, holding her close against his chest. "You are safe. I will never let anyone hurt you again." As the police arrived to cart Chloe away in handcuffs, ensuring her threats to Ruby's children were neutralized forever, Ruby looked up into Emmanuel's face. "I knew you would come," she said, her voice trembling but filled with absolute trust. "The devil himself could not keep me from finding you," he responded, his voice thick with emotion. He leaned down, kissing her gently on her forehead, then the bridge of her nose, before pulling her into a deep, desperate kiss on her mouth that tasted of sweet relief and fierce possession. He pulled back just enough to look into her large eyes. "You are staying with me tonight." She did not protest. Back at his sprawling penthouse, the terrifying ordeal of the warehouse began to wash away under the steam of a long, hot shower. When she stepped out, she slipped on a luxurious silk nightgown that Emmanuel had already ordered and delivered to the room. It draped beautifully over her 5 feet 9 inches curvy frame, the smooth fabric cool against her honey-brown skin. Exhausted, she laid across the massive bed in the guest room, letting her eyes close. A soft knock sounded at the door. Emmanuel stepped in to check on her, having changed into a pair of dark lounge pants. The sight of her laying across the bed, radiant and safe, sent mini electric currents straight through him. He cleared his throat, his voice a low, heavy rumble. "Do you need anything?" Ruby opened her eyes and smiled softly. "No, I am fine." Emmanuel turned to walk out, but he hesitated at the threshold. The thought of leaving her alone in another room after almost losing her was unbearable. He turned back to her, his dark eyes piercing and intense. "I need you in my bed tonight." Ruby froze, her breath catching in her throat. Seeing her reaction, he quickly raised a hand. "No, not for that. But I want to hold you. I want to wake up to you tomorrow morning," he said softly, the raw vulnerability in his voice completely disarming her. Ruby looked at him for a long moment, then stood up and walked toward him. Emmanuel took her by the hand, his firm, warm grip guiding her across the hall and into his master bedroom. Once settled beneath his high thread-count sheets, the sheer proximity of their bodies shifted the air. Ruby shifted, snuggling her back flush against his hard, athletic chest. The sudden sensation of her curves pressing into him made Emmanuel groan. He muttered a low profanity under his breath and said, "I did not think this through." Ruby giggled, a playful spark returning to her eyes, and deliberately wiggled closer to him. Emmanuel cursed again, but this time there was no restraint. He wrapped his powerful arms around her waist, flipping her onto her back so he was hovering over her. His dark eyes burned with a shared passion that had been building for weeks. He pulled her close and kissed her, a deep, demanding hunger taking over. Ruby wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, parting her lips to return the kiss with an intensity that matched his own. The silk of her nightgown slid away, as Emmanuel's hands traced the lush curve of her hips, his touch worshipful against her warm skin. He moved with the slow, disciplined patience of a man who appreciated every detail, kissing a trail from her lips down the column of her neck to the sensitive dip of her collarbone. Ruby gasped, her fingers tangling in his low-cut fade, pulling him closer as a wave of heat flooded her body. When he finally came to her, it was a beautiful, seamless collision of absolute trust and unbridled desire. Every touch was an unspoken promise of protection, a silent declaration that she was cherished. Emmanuel moved with a powerful, rhythmic grace that completely consumed her, his athletic frame perfectly complementing her soft, full curves. Ruby lost herself in the sensation of him, the familiar, intoxicating scent of tobacco and the sea surrounding her as they moved together in perfect harmony. The pain of her past, the betrayal, and the fear from earlier that night completely dissolved, replaced by a fierce, spiritual connection that left them both breathless. They rode the crest of that intense passion together, clinging to one another in the quiet of the room, until they finally collapsed into a tangle of limbs, their hearts beating a frantic, matching rhythm against each other's chests. Later, as the first light of dawn began to peek through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Ruby lay with her head on Emmanuel's chest, listening to the steady, calm beat of his heart. Emmanuel was already awake, his large hand gently stroking her arm. They reflected quietly on the shared passion that had just rewritten both of their futures. For Emmanuel, the uncomplicated, familiar walls he had built around his heart were gone forever. For Ruby, she was no longer just surviving. As she looked out at the Lagos skyline, she knew she was finally, undeniably loved. And that brings us to the end of Ruby and Emmanuel's journey today. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with me, my cultured pearls. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who appreciates the beauty of our blended traditions. Our quest to grow our channel can only be achieved with your incredible support. Every like, share, and subscribe truly means the world to us, and allows us to continue bringing you these incredible stories of love. Before you go, I want to hear from you. What part of today's narrative resonated with you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what part of the world you are joining us from. Until next time, keep celebrating the authenticity of love and heritage. Bye for now.